if your dopamine is too low, you will not feel motivated. If your dopamine is really high, you will feel motivated. And if your dopamine is somewhere in the middle, how you feel depends on whether or not you had higher dopamine a few minutes ago or lower dopamine. This is important. Your experience of life and your level of motivation and drive depends on how much dopamine you have relative to your recent experience. This is, again, something that's just not accounted for in the simple language of dopamine hits. Okay? A simple way to envision dopamine hits is every time you do something you like, you eat a piece of chocolate, dopamine hit. You look at your Instagram, dopamine hit. You see someone you like, dopamine hit. You know, all these things described as dopamine hits neglect the fact that if you scroll social media and you see something you really like, dopamine hit. Sure, there's an increase in dopamine. But then you get to something else and you go, not that interesting. However, had you arrived at that second thing first, you might think that it was really interesting. If you had arrived to that second Instagram post 3 days later or 4 days later, you might find it extremely interesting. Again, how much dopamine you experience from something depends on your baseline level of dopamine when you arrive there and your previous dopamine peaks. This is why when you repeatedly engage in something that you enjoy, your threshold for enjoyment goes up and up and up. So I want to talk about that process, and I want to explain how that process works, because if you understand that process and you understand some of these schedules and kinetics, as we call them, around dopamine, you will be in a terrific position to use any dopamine-enhancing tools that you decide to use. You'll be in an excellent position to modulate and control your own dopamine release for optimal motivation and drive. So many of you have heard of Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is a disease in which people initially start to quake, can't generate smooth movements. They'll have issues with speech, sometimes cognition as well. There are examples like Michael J. Fox, which are kind of early onset Parkinson's. Typically, it hits people a little bit later in life. There's a genetic component, but there is this question, and there's always been this question, whether or not certain lifestyle factors can also create Parkinson's. And some years ago, there was a situation where street laboratories, illicit laboratories, were trying to make a drug called MPPP, which is an opioid-like compound. It's a bit like heroin. And heroin addicts seeking heroin went out and bought what they thought was MPPP. Unfortunately, it was not MPPP. I mean, it would have been tragic if it was anyway, because they were drug addicts, but what they ended up taking turned out to be a lot worse. What they ended up taking was MPTP, and MPTP can arise in the synthesis of MPPP. Somebody created MPTP, and what ended up happening was a large number of young people who were opioid addicts became completely boxed in, paralyzed. Couldn't speak, couldn't blink, couldn't do anything, couldn't function, couldn't move. So both aspects of dopamine transmission were disrupted. They had no motivation and drive. They couldn't generate any movement of any kind. They were literally locked in, frozen. And sadly, this is irreversible. It's irreversible because what MPTP does is it kills the dopaminergic neurons of the substantia nigra, that nigrostriatal pathway that's involved in generating movement, and it kills the dopaminergic neurons of the so-called mesocortical limbic pathway. At the time, I had no understanding of what it is to have very high levels of dopamine or extremely depleted levels of dopamine. There was no reason why I should have that understanding. I mean, of course, I had experienced different pleasures of different kinds, and I've had lows in my life, but nothing to the extreme that I'm about to discuss. I got Giardia, and Giardia is a stomach bug that, if any of you have ever had it, it is terrible. It's terrible diarrhea. You end up very dehydrated very quickly. You drop a ton of weight, and it is extremely unpleasant. I ended up going to the emergency room, and in the emergency room, I begged them for something to stop up my guts, and they gave it to me. They put a saline line in to rehydrate me, and they injected something into the saline bag, and within minutes, I felt more sadness more overwhelming sense of depression, basically lower than I'd ever felt in my entire life. It was absolutely profound. I was crying endlessly without knowing why I was crying. I was miserable. And I asked them, what did you inject? And they said, we injected Thorzine. Thorzine is an antipsychotic drug. It's actually used to block dopamine receptors. It was horrible. The experience of it was miserable, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. And so I actually said to them, what did you give me? They said Thorzine. And I said, you have to give me Ldopa. You have to give me something to get my dopamine levels back up again. And they did. They gave me an injection of Ldopa into the bag, went straight into my bloodstream, and within minutes, I felt fine again. It was incredible, and it really opened up my mind and my experience to what it is to have absolutely plummeted levels of dopamine. Some approaches to maintaining dopaminergic neuron health and things that we can all do for that. But I will tell you, these dopamine neurons that we all have are very precious for movement and mood and motivation. Having experienced what it is to have very, very low levels of dopamine, or to, in this case, to have my dopamine receptors blocked from Thorzine, was eye-opening, to say the least, and has given me tremendous sensitivity to the fact that dopamine is perhaps one of the most powerful molecules that any of us has inside of us, and the one that we ought to all think very carefully about how we leverage. Because while most experiences and most things that we do and take and eat and etc. won't create enormous highs and enormous lows in dopamine, even subtle fluctuations in dopamine really shape our perception of life and what we're capable of and how we feel. And so we want to guard those, and we want to understand them. So let's lean into that understanding about dopamine, and then let's talk about some tools that we can all use to leverage dopamine in order to keep that baseline in the appropriate healthy place and still be able to access those peaks in dopamine, because those, after all, are some of what makes life rich and worth living. All of us have different baseline levels of dopamine. Some of this is sure to be genetic. Some people just simply ride at a level a little bit higher. They're a little bit more excited. They're a little bit more motivated. Or maybe they're a lot more excited or a lot more motivated. Some people are a little mellower. Some people are a little less excitable. And some of that has to do with the fact that dopamine doesn't act alone. Dopamine has close cousins or friends in the nervous system. And I'll just name off a few of those close cousins and friends. Epinephrine, also called adrenaline, is the main chemical driver of energy. We can't do anything at all, unless we have some level of epinephrine in our brain and body. It's released from the adrenal glands, which are right atop our kidneys. It's released from an area of the brainstem called locus ceruleus. And its release tends to wake up neural circuits in the brain and wake up various aspects of our body's physiology and give us a readiness. So it should come as no surprise that dopamine and epinephrine, aka adrenaline, hang out together. In fact, epinephrine and adrenaline are actually manufactured from dopamine.